rapid temperature change and precipitation change. So, but hopefully the team of us will be able to answer any questions they might have in that area. As previous presenters, I'm going to have an overview that is somewhat similar information each slide, just presented in a different way, if you will. Starting off, an overview of IPPW's department capital budget based on year 1 and 9 years of forecast by what I'll call our programs. You'll see it's quite a blend. There's quite a number of programs, if you will. We exceed over $41 million of capital projects in 2019, and in total about a little over $340 million over the 1-year capital and 9-year forecast. As an example, economic development initiatives, when you see that, an example of a project there would be the University Gateway project or the Uptown Public Realm study and the implementation of it. An area, the environment as an example, that would cover off watershed planning, floodplain mapping, community energy investment strategy. Those are just examples of what are within some of those areas. I would also note on that first slide, you'll see a blank on what might concern some individuals, and that is road reconstruction. No money in 2019. That is because all the reconstruction projects for our road are tied with the other parts of the program, like our utilities. So we don't have any road reconstruction projects that are occurring on their own. An example might be out in Country Squire, where we don't have utilities services. We have no intention of putting services there. That would be where it would just be a pure road reconstruction project on its own. Moving on. Oh. That's a different slide than what I have. So, I will deal with that.
I gave you extra time, Cam. I'm not sure what happened there.
Well, I didn't use that time appropriately, it looks like. But this is a slide on growth versus rehab 2019 to 28. It is, I do know the program a little bit. It's basically pretty evenly split between growth versus rehab. The percentages have not changed from my slide, and that's about 46 versus 38 plus a combination of the 10, and that's where it is pretty much an even split. But what you probably will see on that slide is that the green line that is relatively high is more on growth projects. And in 2019, the early years, we have an awful lot of growth-related capital works because of the subdivisions proposed at Conservation Meadows up in that area of Beaver Creek and Conservation Drive. So that throws out of whack what is typically about a 50-50 split, typically. In the area for strategic, just as an example, what would be strategic? The Advanced Metering Initiative would be strategic capital monies as an example. Their pavement condition index is more strategic, and the community, citywide community improvement plan as an example. Let's see this slide. Good. All right. Again, if you take a look on the 10-year capital budget by theme, so the long-term program, again, roads takes up about half of our program, which isn't surprising. Utilities, give or take about a third of it. And again, for 2019, our single year versus the forecast, you'll see that utilities, it's a little bit higher than on average. And again, so it represents probably about 40% of our program, and typically it's probably about a third. And that is again because of the significant infrastructure needs on that Beaver Creek conservation area, which are really tied to development in the next couple of years. By strategic pillars, again, you'll see that almost 3/4 of our capital budget is towards infrastructure renewal, which should be no surprise. The strong community, the 12%, that is, as I mentioned in the pillars, that would be the community improvement plan, and there's an awful lot of planning studies that you'll see identified in the capital program that would be tied to strong community. Capital projects by our reporting criteria, routine versus non-routine. Typically, if you take a look at the forecast or the 10 years, it's about a third of our projects are non-routine, and that would get into master plans, which there's a high level of community involvement. Larger projects like pumping stations, typically because of the dollar value, would be non-routine. Some of our planning initiatives are non-routine because we want to go out to the public as well. But in year 2019, it's about a half split between routine and non-routine. And again, it's tied to some of those bigger infrastructure projects where there's a fair number of projects adding up to a lot of money, but they're pretty typical of what we do, but it's just a new emerging growth area on that part of the city. This leads me to questions. As I noted, I have the majority of IPPW directors here, and I apologize, I do not have any pictures, similar to Mr. Commissioner Dykstra didn't either. Next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Commissioner Rapp and his team? I see Councillor Bonagor and Councillor Freeman.
Through you, Councillor Chair Henry. Thank you, Cam. I just have a couple of questions about some of the items here. So, number 707, which is the reconstruction of Union between Moore and King Streets. I understand a lot of that is, underground work that needs to be done, but it also factors in bike trails, the spur line crossing, and other issues of very strong community interest. I'm just wondering if keeping it as routine will provide enough capacity for input from the multiple stakeholders on that stretch of road, or if this is something that should be changed to non-routine, just given the high public interest in that portion of the road.
Through Chair Henry to Councillor Bonagor, certainly we can. It could be appropriate to label it as non-routine and allow for a little bit of council dialogue when we bring the project forward. It is the pedestrian flows in that area are pretty high. I know the region has had a particular interest in that crossing, and there's an awful lot occurring in that intersection as well that probably warrants a lot of discussion. So that would be a fair direction, certainly.
So I would do that at the end.
Yep.
Bring that forward. Okay. And
I've written it down.
Okay, and I have another one that I would like to raise, just as a point of discussion potentially for council, and that's lines request 718, which is, it sounds very ordinary. It's routine spending for road widenings and intersection improvements across the city. And the trigger on these matters appears, it says it's traffic congestion. But I just want to raise the idea that, congestion is not always our enemy. And sometimes congestion can play a role in street safety. Research shows that it can help promote lower speeds, more caution at corners for drivers, and more. And I'm just wondering if by having routine enabling of wider roads and smoother intersections, are we kind of undermining ourselves as a city in our efforts to really have safe streets and multimodal transportation? So that's one where it's not a huge amount of money, but it's something where I know residents in my area would like to know if there's going to be changes made to intersections and road widths in their neighbourhoods. So is this something that we would want to have come to us? Are these matters so routine that we would be besieged? I'm just curious as to how much of this is done in the city and whether it could be something that also we could have some input into.
Through your Chair Henry to Councillor Bonagor, it's interesting. The majority of the monies in this area would be spent directly tied to a development, where the development, the size of it was such that it warranted a traffic study to determine if a widening or a left turn lane might be needed, or dedicated right in, right out, that type of detail. So the idea of, or the ability to discuss with neighbors, it's at the very tail end of the planning process, if you will, when we're getting into site plan typically. I think when you get to general congestion leading to safer streets, and I mean the old study that is you can keep widening roads and the only thing you know for certain is it keeps filling. Perhaps a discussion through the update to the Transportation Master Plan about our levels of service and the expectation would help drive whether a widening or a turn lane is needed based on the expectations after that study, if that makes sense.
Yep, that sounds great.
Okay,
thank you.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a very helpful observation to have, and the Transportation Master Plan is an update that's coming this year, as we heard in the business plan, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about that. I know I've got some bees in my bonnet on policy framing of those that will help enable things that we want and disable things that we don't want, and we'll have a robust conversation around those. So. Right, I had Councillor Freeman next, if that's all. Councillor Bonagor? Okay, then Councillor Bodley.
So the first thing I wanted to talk about was 513. So that's extending sanitary mains into the service private properties. And I guess I had a question about whether I did go back and have a look at the sanitary master plan and what the 3 priority areas were for servicing. So I can see that the majority of the first priority areas are along Earlsville Road and in and around the wellhead on the west side. And I just wondered, in future capital years, because it appears as though those expenditures may happen on my side of town where people are currently on some areas still on a septic. I'm hopeful that we can be thoughtful about how we want to prioritize this and if we want to actually prioritize this right now. And the reason why I ask is because some of those areas, for lack of a better way to say it, are protected from turnover associated with zoning because of those services. And not to say that people wouldn't like to see them serviced. I don't mean that. And it may be necessary from a wellhead protection lens. But it may be that we want to have a broader conversation on that and the impact that that may have on zoning. So that's that. With regard to item 535, does this account for the pilot project? Like, is that number accounting for a reduction in expenditures associated with thinking differently about the sediment control that we have?
Just give me a moment, if you will, Councillor Freeman.
And I guess that translates ahead to 20, 21, 22, and so on. Because if this sediment pilot with the Ministry of Environment is successful, and we're able to use that sediment removal on landscaping priorities within the city, as opposed to landfilling, it would be really great if we could see some reductions in those lines.
Certainly through Councillor Henry to Councillor Freeman on that particular item. That is the ongoing maintenance without knowing the benefit of the pilot project we have on Pond 73 or whatever it might be. So if that pond, the sediment reuse is successful in the boulevards, then what that would change is perhaps the dollar figure associated with each of those pond cleanouts, or we could keep the dollar figure the same and advance the pond clear out process, because even this doesn't really meet what the expectations might be. And would you like me to respond now to the private services initiative?
For sure. I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize.
Oh, no, that's quite all right. With respect to item 513 and the private services, what we could do is as part of an evaluation process, once we've come up with an area or two, we could reach out to the ward councillor to determine an appropriate process, if you will, because I know also in part of your ward, some of those streets that have septic services, there's also a rural cross-section as well. Yeah. And so if we're going in there to do the one services, I think we want to have an overriding understanding of what's the full gamut, if you will, of service, the full curbs, sidewalks versus gutters versus street lighting. All of those things would go all hand in hand. So I think we'd want to have that discussion. So we can work through by ward councillor when it looks like we might be moving into an area and discuss the appropriate way of communicating.
Well, it certainly made sense in some areas on the priority list because they're main streets like Herbsville Road, for example. Like having a break in the services on Herbsville Road doesn't make sense, and I understand that. So, but what you just said also lends into item 647. I'm jumping ahead because I have more comments on the other piece, but I'm hopeful that the scope of that cultural heritage landscape study is Colonial Acres, because my neighborhood is really, really interested to try to be a focus of a cultural heritage landscape, which would then inform what you were just talking about in terms of the rural cross-section and all those pieces.
Through Councillor Henry, Councillor Freeman. I'm not certain if the Municipal Heritage Committee and our heritage planner have gone through that analysis to pick 1, 2, or 3 of which of the heritage neighborhoods or proposed heritage neighborhoods should come forward, but I can get back to you certainly on that.
Yeah, well, I can tell you for the landscape piece, I've got a ward full of people that want to see this happen, and they did a whole bunch of research on this. And so my other question is with regard to item 537. And so I guess I thought that work was done, and so I was surprised to see Caroline, Herb, and William in conjunction with LRT at $1.4 million in 2019.
There's a good answer for that one, Mr. Rapp.
Again, yes, through Councillor Henry to Councillor Freeman. The work has been completed, but through the graciousness of the Region of Waterloo and cash flowing, those works were being done in advance of when our utilities could pay for it, so we're just paying them back, essentially.
That's kind of what I thought the answer was, but I wanted to double check. And then if I look to the non-routine, that was it. Yeah, those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next up I have Councillor Bodley, then Councillor.
Thank you, through you, Chair Henry. Maybe this is just a curious one. You know, when I see an amount for road resurfacing as a resident or a non-engineer, I have no idea whether that's the right amount or not. But number 501 is talking about 30 pieces of technology that I've purchased in my lifetime at some point, and it's $65,000, which seems like a lot of money for 12 smartphones, 12 laptops, and 6 desktops. So I'm just curious if maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
It's all out of the building reserve. And I think Max may have left the building, because even though it's a building services expenditure, Max in the other room?
Yep.
Okay. I just can't see that.
Through Councillor Henry to Councillor Bodley. Actually, the dollar figure, by the time we put all of our operating systems and special applications, if you will, a laptop can be $3,000, $2,000, and 12 of them $24,000, and then you start doing with the desktops. I wish it could be cheaper, but yeah, that's my understanding.
Nope, thank you. I appreciate that.
Wrong, Max? But generally, it's not inexpensive.
The reason that the laptop computer is around $2,000, $3,000 is because of the licensing. Normally, when you buy a laptop on the market, right, they only come with the OEM version of the Windows, and those Windows cannot connect to the corporate network. So normally, when we get those kind of laptop, we have to wipe those system out and to purchase an enterprise license to enable them to connect to the corporate network. So this is why it is relatively more expensive.
Thank you, Max.
There you go. Thank you. Now I can answer the question if somebody asked me. Appreciate it.
When I bought one from you, Mr. Bodley, I only paid. What do you mean? Yeah, no, that's good.
Well, I did used to work at Best Buy, so. Sorry, a few other questions. Number 561. I'm curious. This is a. We provide local contractors a discounted rate for non-potable water supply, and we're investing capital budget funds into that. I'm just curious if we have any revenue, idea of what kind of revenue this program generates for us, and whether there are other things to consider in terms of community benefits for that.
Through Councillor Henry to Councillor Bodley, I am not aware of what revenue we might get. I can certainly follow up with that. To answer that question, my mind is starting to wander a little bit about helping secure good potable water for those contractors as opposed to going to other sources. I don't know, but I will find out for you. Certainly. Oh, Mike Pugliese has an answer. Wonderful.
There we go. I'll turn over to Mike.
Through your chair, Henry, might not have the 100% answer, but we do have a non-potable well available to contractors to use, so they would buy water at the wholesale rate. So we're not actually profiting from it. So we would buy the water from the region at the wholesale rate, and we're basically selling it to the contractor to fill up their water truck for use in fertilization or groundskeeping, things like that, at the same wholesale rate. So we're not profiting specifically. So that's for that one well that we have here at the service center. I'm not certain if there's other non-potable wells throughout the city. I know there's some you see by City Hall here. There's that little well by it says not safe for drinking consumption. I don't know if those are active water distribution pumps. So,
and again, I apologize. I was thinking potable water from the safety perspective, not non-potable.
Thank you. This is something that I had brought up with you in private, but I thought I'd bring up in public just again, is with respect to 591 trails in the new development area in Northwest Waterloo. And I do have a little bit of a concern about these being classified as routine versus non-routine, particularly given the environmentally sensitive landscapes that we're talking about putting trails through. So I just want some clarification again as to whether where that trail system is ultimately going to go could come back to council.
Through Councillor Henry to Councillor Bodley, certainly the actual trail locations could come back, and what I would think is some of the rationale could come back. As I noted previously in our discussion, some rationale, to be quite frank, we would want to contain as it relates to environmentally protected plant species, things like that, that when you draw attention to it, ultimately that conservation measure ends up in leading to a result where the species is destroyed or whatever, because people in their excitement to see this might go out and wreck the habitat. So outside of certain things like that, we can certainly bring forward the rationale and the proposed locations to council.
Sorry, and just for a point of reference, I guess, does that mean that it necessarily has to be routine versus non-routine, or is there a way for for some of the exact location of the trails to come back without this being identified as routine? Because I do recognize the funding aspect of it being routine.
Correct. That's what I would suggest, that keeping it routine, but it's up to council, but giving direction to staff that the process of trail determination involve a level of council involvement or engagement.
Excellent, thank you. I'm curious about number 600, which is out in 2025 and 2026, the Bish Street reconstruction at the very edge of the city. Do we? The identification is it suggests, and this is going to follow a theme of a couple of my next few questions, are it suggests that it's to be constructed in conjunction with Herbsville Road reconstruction by the region. So do we have any indication from the region as to when Herbsville Road is going to be reconstructed? And maybe I'll tie this to my next question so we don't have to go back and ask the same thing over again. The same deal is on 602 and I believe on 622 as well. 602 being actually maybe not on 602, but on 622. Excuse me. The water main on between on Herbsville Road, Iron Needles to Columbia Street. So just trying to get some understanding of whether we know when the region is going to be reconstructing Herbsville Road. How those dollar figures got assigned to the years that they're in, because I had heard a rumor that particularly with respect to 622, that the region was delaying the widening of Herbsville Road beyond 2024. So just some, I guess, how that works.
Okay. Through Councillor Henry, Councillor Bodley. I'm not aware of the exact timing of the region's capital program for Herbsville Road, and when I look to my left to the behind a bit, no one's exactly where. We will get that information for you. However, there's a couple of different things happening. With 622, I would suggest that it would be early in the 2020s based on our capital spending. Some of that could be payback to the region depending on the timing, but again, I will find out. For 600, the timing at 2025 and 2026 is probably more aligned to the proposed developments that could occur. Those areas are designated as future development and as residential or open space, depending on exactly which part of the parcels you're looking at. So with future planning coming online, that's when we anticipate we could be putting the services in that street, subject to the planning approvals, not wanting to fetter that process. But Herbsville Road, we will get those details for you of exactly when that is in the capital program for the region.
Perfect. And I guess just to understand the process, if or when we find out what the region's plans are, do we move those out of our forecasting into later years or earlier years, or do we have any process in place to understand how that works?
Through Councillor Henry to Councillor Bodley, we do have a process. It can vary a couple of different ways. The ability for us to pay, whether it's a utility in the reserves or CRF or DCs, but we will try and align it with exactly when the region or the year thereafter, because typically they might bill us for some of that work when they've completed the work, so it might be the following year, but we do align it very carefully. From a cash flow perspective, as I said, it also depends on the reserve's ability to pay.
And one last question, if I may there, Chair Henry. Thank you. So on 602, which is the Beaver Creek Road and Conservation Drive reconstruction, I just want to continue to perhaps publicly comment regarding the traffic concerns on the Wilmot line and making sure that we are continuing to monitor traffic studies to make sure that we're keeping under the 1,000 cars per day commitment that we had previously made. And I will say that I do have some, I know that there are a lot of things going on with this development, and we don't know exactly the timing, notwithstanding the dates that are in the capital budget here. But I will say that I do fear that once development does occur on Conservation Drive here and we start seeing people in there, that we may have let the horse out of the bag with respect to, or out of the barn, excuse me, with respect to getting traffic off the Wilmot line. And I know that this reconstruction is only going to the small cul-de-sac road that the name of which is escaping me, Snowcrest. But I think having an idea around what we're going to do between Snowcrest and the Wilmot line to try and dissuade people from being on that road is something that we should be considering when those plans do come back to council.
through Councillor Henry. I'm not sure there wasn't necessarily a question there, but absolutely, our previous councils did make a commitment to consider. I would like to point out there wasn't a commitment that they would do whatever it took to keep the vehicles down to 1,000, but consider what was within the city's control to try and lower that volume down to 1,000 per day. I know we will be going out and doing this spring some traffic counts on the Wilmot line as well, so we'll be able to be able to let council know what that is. And I think in previous studies, what we did find is most of the traffic on Wilmot line is generated from the surrounding townships themselves, from the north and west, as opposed to city traffic. But ultimately, as we get grower, even one car is more than the day before as development occurs. So I do understand that.
I think certainly the biggest barrier we face, as Commissioner Rapp has identified, is most of the traffic is originating in the townships. The road is in the township. The township itself has not been particularly persuadable on the different view of what Wilmot line should be. However, the ward councillor in which that line now exists is a different ward councillor, and perhaps neighboring municipal politician to politician conversation might be a good way to start a new dialogue and see what may happen. So if I can leave that with you.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I've already engaged in some of those conversations, but I will say that although I agree that the traffic today is coming primarily from the townships, my concern is that if we're putting 5,000 people on that road, that might not necessarily be the case 5 years from now. So I'm trying to think proactively about how we can, with our roads, city-owned roads, how we can potentially keep traffic off there is, I think, worthwhile considering the environmental impacts of having traffic on so close to the moraine.
So next I have Councillor Vasic.
Thanks, through you, Chair Henry. I have two. So one is just, I don't want to move it off necessarily, but I do want more dialogue around some of the road reconstruction. So particularly Nielsen, because a lot of people who live in and around that area have expressed some concern. I mean, like, that's right where I live, so I just see people when I'm walking my dog. Because it is a pretty short road. There's already a lot of challenges there with St. Agnes and Blue Vale, lots of cars sort of dropping off kids. So there's lots of concerns around safety and, like, how long is this going to take? Where similar to Vermont Street, like, how are we going to get our groceries up there? Things like that. So I don't know if this necessarily needs to go to a non-routine, but it is a high ticket item in a small area. So just wondering if we might find some way to dialogue about it. And I know I've already talked, so it's not to say that I haven't already talked, and like, transportation is already working on it, but I just wanted to bring it up here too.
Right. Certainly through Councillor Henry to Councillor Vasic. Similar to Councillor Freeman's discussion about the urban cross-section and going in with services, we can reach out to yourself as the early, well, I'll say pre-communication stage, and discuss the various ways to communicate with the school boards, with our engineering and our transportation groups, to understand the nuances, if you will, of what's occurring there traffic-wise, and work out a communication strategy and input. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I'd be happy to help, and not to get into operations, but if there's any way I can help, I'd be happy to. And then the other thing that might be of council interest to bring to non-routine potentially is the traffic calming implementation and traffic calming studies, unless there's an aspect of that will be non-routine. I mean, we talked about that as a strategic planning as something that is of high public interest, so.
Through you, Councillor Henry, to Councillor Vasic, those projects in particular, the release of the funding is very routine. But again, the process of traffic calming and the discussions of the alternatives of traffic bumps, traffic circles, widening center medians, chicanes, all of those things, we will be actively involved with the community. absolutely, and coming up with what we believe is a sound transportation solution based on safety, and bring that forward. And the community will be in attendance in the chamber, I can assure you. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no way this won't end up in chambers on each and every project. So
Okay, great.
no matter what it's classified as.
Sorry. So then this would just be a clarification piece for me. So we're releasing funds to do this, and there are public consultations like incorporated in that, but we're just saying, go ahead, you can use this money under the good faith process that you will, like, we'll consult with the public. Just curious about the process.
Certainly.
Just walk me through the process.
Sure, through Councillor Henry to Councillor Vasic. Some of that, there is some good faith, and that is to initiate the studies and the alternatives from a purely technical safety point of view. We do that technically and come up with alternatives. So we need the money to start with those, that process. And then once we have the various options, first we have to understand the problem before we can solve the problem. And so part of that is data collection and understanding, which requires the release of the funding so we can do those that analysis, if you will. So that's why we need the money to start with. But our process, and I think it might be actually in our policy documents, correct me if I'm wrong, about how we will do traffic calming measures, like within how we notify within so many meters down the corridors or the entrances to subdivisions. We have a fairly rigorous process of how we let the public know of these public open houses, or PICs as we call them, information centers occurring. So that's been well established. We can always still improve, but we will definitely have active community involvement, but it's just to get that money to start understanding if there's a problem too, and then what the problem is.
Yeah, and 736 is to fund the studies, and 732 is to implement the studies, and the time lag between those that are funded under 736 and those that are implemented under 72 is, which is part of the problem of the implementation, is nobody remembers that they agreed with the outcome of the study when it comes back to actually do it, and we can't really catch up. So it's an ongoing challenge that provides a lot of theater in chambers and lots of engagement with the public, positive and otherwise. Other questions for Commissioner Rapp on items in his area? I am seeing none. Are there, what I've heard definitively as an item to be reclassified from routine to non-routine is 707, which is under recommendation 19. Are there others? I know people ask questions, but I don't know definitively if there were others. See. Yeah, and 591, which was the West Side Trails, is funding from 2020 and beyond. It didn't have any funding I saw allocated in 2019, so it wouldn't be listed on our approval today. Well, not approval, but under routine measure. Mr. Rapp?
Yes, certainly. If it would help council for next year, we can flush that capital project sheet out a little bit and identify how we will engage the public, if that will help Councillor Bodley.
We'll get a capital sheet update. That's useful. Were there any other items then from council? Hearing from Councillor Bodley's back and forth on 561, which was the non-potable water that we basically give away for free, and we're going to spend a bunch of money to give more away for free. I'm curious about that. Mr. Witzel?
Yeah, through you, Chair Henry, just to clarify, that's in regards to the non-potable water station that we have at the service center, where various contractors will come and get that water. Previously, we didn't have a retail rate or a rate for that, so we've applied the regional's wholesale rate for that, but that's not bulk water that we're receiving from the region. It's in the well, if you will. So okay, it's a small revenue opportunity that was built in a couple of years ago, but I think that might help clarify. So that's just
a good clarification. We don't have to then turn around and pay the region for that money. We keep, okay. There is a revenue associated with an expenditure. That's really what I was looking for. If it was an expenditure with no revenue, that was something I was going to want to see more about before I released the funding, but I'm happy leaving it as is. So I haven't heard anything from anyone else. So I'd like to take 15, 16, 17, and 19 with the note that except for 707 is under 19. And look for a mover and seconder. I'll have to step out for 18. That's why I'm separating it. So moved by Councillor Bonigar, seconded by Councillor Hanmer. Any comments? All those in favor? That's carried. Are there any items that we wish to speak to about reallocations in 2020 and beyond? I didn't hear any, but I want to confirm those before I vacate the chair in the room so that we can approve number 18. I don't hear any. So with that, I think the next item up is approval of recommendation 18 by people who are not me. Or disagree.
Moved by Councillor Freeman, second by Councillor Hanmer. Any further discussion? All those in favor? That's all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Council. That was very efficient and effective. I know staff appreciated the additional direction and refinement. Is there any notice of motion? Seeing none, no communications and correspondence ourselves or from the region. There's no unfinished business. Is there any new business, Council? Seeing none, are there any questions, Council? We asked a lot today. That was good. Seeing none, I'll look for adjournment before I turn it over to the Mayor. Councillor Veith, Councillor Freeman, all those in favor? Carried. Mayor, go ahead.
Welcome to the City of Waterloo Special Council Meeting, Monday, February 4th, 2019. To have a disclosure of pecuniary interest in the general nature thereof. Seeing none. There's a couple of bylaws we need to enact. Should anybody be interested? Councillor Veith and Councillor Freeman are. All those in favor? Motion to go in closed session. Councillor Bodley, Councillor Bonigar. All those in favor? Motion to go in closed session.